of his upbringing and conditioning. So without wasting any more time, I invite Sundar to the floor. Uh, Sundar, you can start sharing your screen. You can talk for about 40 to 45
Yeah,
minutes or even longer,
sure.
and then we can take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you so much for this kind invitation to kickstart this very interesting conference. It's always a pleasure to talk to students and faculty of Christ University with whom I've had a long engagement. So thank you for this opportunity to come back to this again. I did look at the note which you and Professor Renu Abraham had done for the conference, and I can see that you've already started off thinking about these questions. I mean, raising the problems of decolonization and looking at Asian narratives in the context of children and childhood narratives from other parts of the world, particularly Asia and Africa. So that's already, in a sense, a decolonization project. And today, decolonization has become a very extremely important term which has been under discussion in a variety of places, not just within academics, but largely driven deeply within various university and student movements, particularly from South Africa and across Africa. And it has also had a deep impact on the in other disciplines, including medical science, the possibility of looking at other knowledge systems in the sciences, and so on. So what I'm going to do is to start off with a very brief motivation for looking at the question of decolonizations, including some of the potential problems that might arise from our question of decolonization, and then come back specifically to the question of decolonizing children and what does it actually mean and why would one want to do it and how could one do this. Even let's assuming that we are interested in doing it, what does it mean to say that we want to decolonize children and how would we do it. So what I'll do, just so that you have some of these points which you can see, I will share my PowerPoint with you, and then I will just go through some of the basic questions around decolonizing, the idea of decolonization. The, 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 the argument about decolonization has been there for quite some time, although, as I said, it has picked up quite a bit of steam, particularly because of certain political movements coming from Africa and South America in particular. Although we know from post-colonial studies and later, there's always been an engagement to the question of decolonization and the importance of decolonization, but there are various other problems around it. So very quickly, to define the major core idea, which has been part of these various debates on decolonization around the world, it is primarily a critique of a dominance of particular kinds of knowledge. Now, it has always been phrased in such a manner that the scholars and activists from many of these countries like Africa and South America who led the movement on decolonization were arguing that, look, the world is being dominantly produced and imagined in the conceptual framework of a very few countries in the West. And therefore, the idea that much of how we understand ourselves and the knowledge systems which are integral to our practices, including our complete educational system, and that is why decolonization has been most, vehement and active within the university systems, changing universities and schools through this process of decolonization. So because of the dominance of particular kinds of practices associated with a particular small group of communities around the world, whom we might want to call as West, but the West is in quotes and has to be qualified very carefully, and recognizing that and therefore asking that we replace them with other knowledge systems and practices. Although the term indigenous is often used here, it's a broad idea in which what we say is that there are many kinds of ideas and systems coming from different cultures, and do they have a place in our contemporary understanding of our lives? And it's specifically a call to replace the hegemony of Western systems of knowledge in almost every discipline. And you can see this everywhere. You can see it in your college, in your classrooms. You can see it outside in the world. You can see in the way disciplines are defined. You can see it even in the way disciplines are produced, the way new disciplines come. For example, in my own discipline of philosophy, it would be very difficult if you said philosophy as a term. It's often de facto associated with what should be called Western philosophy, or a philosophy coming from a particular perspective alone. If you talk about literary theory, for example, literary theory by de facto becomes the kind of literary theories produced in the West, and therefore to be able to, then we are forced to put into a position of saying Indian literary theory, African literary theory, just like you are put into a position, forced into a position of calling something as Indian philosophy, African philosophy, and so on. And that is the part of the politics of the way knowledge systems are produced. And finally, it is a, to put it all in one line, it is a recognition that the Eurocentric model, which governs the way we think and act and read and learn in our educational institutions, are primarily Eurocentric. And therefore, get people upset as much as decolonization does. And particularly because decolonization is a much broader idea. It is not just about the so-called quote unquote East and the so-called quote unquote West. It is much broader, and therefore, people tend to react quite angrily when we invoke the questions of decolonization. Rather than discussing the politics of it, I want to look at some specificities of what is it to decolonize and what have we been decolonizing. Among all this activist movement, one of the most important drive has been towards decolonizing the university. I think all the societies have recognized, and this is a very, very important tool of colonialism, a very important tool by which the state, the society controls or has some notion of influence on its citizens, and that is through education. And that's why education becomes such a contentious and a very important aspect of the British colonial rule on India. And the reason why, for example, the Macaulay Minutes and the reason why the education policies are produced are actually to be able to, produce, people who think like the British but who are not British. In a sense, a remaking the civilizational imperative of what we call as a civilizational imperative of colonialism. So therefore, much of the the decolonization movement has targeted the university. And within the university, what are they targeting? They talk about the curriculum. They talk about the way we teach. They talk about the syllabus. What are the books we read? What are the books all of us read in our classrooms? Why do we choose to read those books? How did we choose that these are the major books which we are going to use in our curriculum? Look at the amount of work from Africa, Asia. I mean, not just Africa in a very general sense, maybe South America, many parts of Africa, South Asia, Vietnamese writers, for example. Where are all the Indonesian, Thai writers? So, I mean, where are all these people in our curriculum? Who are we actually reading in the name of, literature or philosophy or the sciences and so on? So these are very important aspects. And one of the interesting consequences of this decolonization movement, one of the targets of decolonization is also the library. Because remember, again, library is such an important aspect of traditional learning. And the library is a very valued place where books which are valued are placed there, which students are supposed to read, and others who want to learn go to the library to read. And again, our libraries are populated by what kind of books? By which publishers? Where are the books which are being produced in thousands in different languages in India, written by people who don't come from well-known universities in the West and so on? What happens to their library, to the library which has their books? That, asking such a question is to ask a question regarding decolonization. the question of decolonization can then be extended. It is not just about the books we read or the curriculum or the classes you do, but it distills right into our habits of seeing, habits of thinking. It is so deep that social and individual concepts, the way we define ourselves, the way we think what a society should be, including ideas of development, progress, etc., are all, where do they come from? And that's really the point. Have they been produced from an influence of certain cultures over other cultures, to at the exclusion of other diverse concepts and ideas which might help us lead a different life? And when we do look, therefore, at the question of, again, quote unquote, indigenous knowledge or alternate knowledge compared to the dominant Western systems, you can find them in every such concept. You can take the idea of nature. You have multiple theories of nature from different cultures. The idea of human, there is no one idea of human. In fact, one of the functions of cultural production of knowledge is to produce theories on what it is to be human, produce theories on what is it to be in a human relation, whether with a family or whether with a community or whether the society, and so on. So we know that there is enormous amount of work and ideas present from the perspective of decolonization. Movement began with and used this idea of, the question of, the question of knowledge. There is also the possibility that, I mean, there's not the possibility, there is also the process of decolonization is also very important in the context of narratives, stories, films, performances, and so on. We know we are deeply influenced by certain cultural models, certain cultural influences, particularly in entertainment. We know, for example, I talk to kids in Bangalore, for example, they know everything about the TV serial happening in the US or UK and so on. They have such great knowledge about each one of them. And I don't think there's in principle something wrong in that. All I'm trying to say is that the decolonization argument is that this kind of an influence is not a natural influence, that there is a particular reason why we tend to think, well, I listen to this music and I watch these shows because they're more interesting, they are better. Even the valuing of them through various other criteria for valuation is itself a part of the colonial. And this is the argument. Okay, I hope we'll have some discussion on some of these points. This is the larger argument on the larger decolonization movement. And in all this, of course, is a very crucial link between language and colonization. And again, it's a topic which is much larger, which I'm sure will come up in the conference anyway, because it's an extremely important idea or linking, a force which makes colonization possible. We can see that, of course, in the way in which English becomes a dominant language of the colonized cultures under British, how French becomes in French, colonized societies, how French becomes the de facto language, like in places in Africa and so on. So and that's a fascinating link between the idea of language and the idea of colonization, which again, a point which I won't discuss right now, but to leave it in the back of your mind, that language becomes a vehicle for creating a colonized mind or a colonized society. Because language, that's a function of language. Language produces concepts, language produces patterns, which we recognize when we speak in a particular language. We are actually talking about a different experience, different societies, and different culture. And therefore, colonization needs a very, very interesting way to deal with the question of language. Okay, I do recognize, I did get the message that my voice, you dropped off for a second. Please do, Sonia, if you can just speak in the audio, because I can't see the Zoom here. So anytime you want to stop me, please let me know if, there's a drop off.
Yeah, that was just for a minute.
Yeah. So, so one of the ways by which this has been very famously argued by some very important, so-called leaders of the decolonization movement, has been the move from the idea, problematizing the idea of this university, somewhere capturing the idea of the uni there, something unified, unity, oneness, present in the idea of a university, to something called the pluriversity. And Mebembe, very well-known African decolonization scholar, argues that by pluriversity, he is basically talking about questions of epistemic diversity. What he means by that is different knowledge systems are part of our learning rather than one specific kind of a knowledge system. I mean, there are many examples of it. Again, I won't go into that. For example, there are different types of mathematics. There are now disciplines which are called as ethnomathematics, and one, you could be studying mathematics, for example, or for your whole life through your school and college, and not even know that there are actually different fundamental assumptions and structures which are different.
Yeah, Sundar, lost you again here now.
Of producing knowledge about ourselves and about the world coming from
Yeah.
different.
So, Sundar, you might want to repeat the last point. We lost you again.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about this. I think it's a Chromebook problem with Zoom. So anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that the idea is just about bringing in the questions of diversity within the classroom, not just in terms of representations of people and so on, but just in representations of different types of knowledge systems and different versions of multiple realities, as Mignola would have it. But a very important, very important way to understand decolonization has also been extended by De Souza, a very important, much referred to argument that the idea of colonialism is not just between the West and the non-West, although it's dominantly represented very clearly in the colonization of Asia and Africa. But Santos would argue that Southern Europe itself is colonized by Northern Europe. And this is true, that the argument here is that the colonization process is not reducible only to some particular kind of a culture. In the way you look at the West and the East, the questions of racism become very prominent. And we know in the colonial literature on the colonized, race marginalized elements of a particular society, and that which it would include, of course, the migrants, the poor, etc. What it means is that we are always in a position of colonialism and under the force of the potential force of decolonization. And I think this is very important even when we talk of decolonization in the Indian context, because it's not just about a so-called quote unquote, the opposition or the enemy of so-called West, or for example, the British or the Anglo-American, but rather it's really about questions of becoming aware of the forces which lead us to colonize somebody else. And it is in that sense that the question of decolonization of children become very important. There are many arguments for decolonization. Excuse me, and I'm not going to go through them here because I want to spend some time with the idea of decolonizing children. But it is just to say that there is not enough of a reflective awareness of our own sense of a life. If there is one lesson I want to learn from this decolonization process, it is that we have not reflected deeply enough about our own situations, our own experiences, and our own existence in the world we live in. And that world it's not about the West and the East and so on. It's not about different religions which all of us participate in. It is about, in a sense, making sense of our lives with our categories. And if you ask me why would that be important, I would say it's because the world is producing, moving towards a future in which most of us have had no voice. In fact, in a way, especially in a very digitally driven, technologically driven world, we are actually being following the dictates and the vision of a handful of people. The handful of people who run these digital companies, who produce machines for us, which we think is natural and inevitable and something which we cannot live with. But through that, we get colonized very deeply. In fact, I would extend that argument to say colonization through especially digital technology is something which all of you have to worry about and think about in your day-to-day lives. And it is not just about a historical process of decolonization. Therefore, I think the fact that decolonization is important in so that it gives us a vision, a way in which we construct a vision which matches what you want, what we want, what different cultures want in their own imagination of what the future should be. So I will, using this as a basic kind of a background on understanding what decolonization is, let me look at a little more contentious point about the idea of decolonizing children. And I specifically use the term decolonizing children rather than saying decolonizing children's education, decolonizing children's narratives, and so on, because this has actually been a question which I'm sure many of you who have been working in this field, or as teachers or parents and others, have always thought about and have had to respond to this idea about many ideas surrounding the question of children here. So I'll begin with the basic question of what does it mean to say you want to decolonize children, or in what sense would I invoke this, and why would you want to do it? So assuming that children are already present doing what they do, why would we want to do it? One way in which the idea of decolonization is repeatedly invoked, particularly in the context of the colonized, is to say that we are all filled with these kind of mental maps of images and concepts of a different society. And since those societies create these concepts and create this knowledge of what their life is based on the circumstances of their life, people living in very cold countries have very different ways of understanding certain kinds of human relationships and existence and so on, as against perhaps somebody living in a tropical forest. So the question, the argument therefore is, what kind of ideas and concepts should we have? So one immediate argument, especially in recent times, about this decolonization project in education is to say that given the surplus, given the excess of material that we read, of material produced from a very few societies. For example, if you look at poetry, many of our children, including, even today, have all grown up with enormous access to, for example, British poetry. They'll be able to quote British poets and tell you a lot about British poets at the expense of a large number of poets writing in different countries, particularly from Asia and Africa. And therefore, what it does is it starts building up an idea in children, and of course, as we go on, even as adults, that only worthwhile poetry is being produced by one particular society or one type of people. And similarly, when people have been talking about the influence of science writing, how science textbooks are written, very often they point out that the repeated use of only European figures as models of scientists tends to make students think that Asians and Africans do not have the capacity to do science. And this was extended, as you very well know, in the gender movement, in replacing the general pronoun he with the word she, or a more neutral one between he and she, because a girl child is going to read all the time in the books that she's reading in her textbooks, all gender reference to anything, particularly if they are scientists and doctors, etc., were all with the with this image of a he. So one part of the decolonization is to say that, look, maybe we have to discover our ideas or get rid of all the excess of ideas from certain types of cultures and populate them with ideas from other cultures, including your own culture and so on. I mean, and therefore there's always a culture war which is behind this decolonization. And that is not the point which interests me as much here, although it is a very important problem in deciding what text we choose to teach our students and so on. So without going too much into it, if you have questions, we can talk about it. I'm just saying that so that we see one aspect of the decolonizing children has been about this argument. Teach them, for example, I'm sure you have heard this, there have been claims that Indian children learn so much about, nursery rhymes, which are British, for example, and therefore with very specific European imageries, and the fact that you could replace them with various kinds of nursery rhymes which come from different Indian languages and Indian societies might be more interesting. And there have been very interesting books and examples which have come from that, which I think is very interesting to look at and also very useful. The past, as I
Uh,
already, yeah,
Sorry
you
to
lost me.
interrupt, Sundar.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
after decolonizing mind thoughts, that was
Yeah. After decolonizing the minds and thoughts, is it?
like the nursery rhyme part you said, and
Yeah,
then
okay, fine. So the other aspect of this was about, as I said, going back to the past, an argument that decolonization has often been misunderstood as saying one is claiming that the decolonization process is to push our cultures back to, so quote unquote, traditional modes of learning and thinking and living. But that's really just one aspect of it, which for me is a very problematical aspect. To me, the more important reason why we even think of decolonization is as a methodological way of finding a more egalitarian vision of the future, where we produce ideas from different communities in order to share what we think the world should be like. And also, once we say that there are all these kinds of decolonization as a project is important, there are then very specific questions. Decolonize what? So as we said, the decolonization in the university was a very important, powerful movement. You could then extend it to say, well, do we decolonize minds? A very important repeated image which is invoked in most, even including in the Indian freedom movement, the call to decolonize our minds. And what could that mean? And that's we could talk about that. But one could say it means that you get away from the comfort of the kind of the conceptual vocabulary that we have to make sense of the world around us. So today, if you are trained in a particular kind of learning of, let's say, the canonical text from the European tradition, then the way you look at the world, the way you understand society, etc., may be influenced by it, right? So the argument about this decolonization or the mind, decolonizing mind and thoughts, is to say, can we have alternate ideas from where these narratives are possible? I would also extend this suspicion, this argument that we should be decolonizing the school and what we teach, the curriculum alone, into also the idea of decolonizing action, how we act. How we act is often based on what kind of thoughts, what kind of concepts we have. How we act as individuals is very deeply related to the way our ideas of individualism are formed. And therefore actions which are very habitual. Remember, we don't think too much about actions, we act. And that's a point about making habits, habits of actions. Now, it's also very important to say we decolonize actions. We decolonize to extend it further to what performance artists and theater and dance performers, others often say. You have to decolonize the body, because we have specific images of the body. And here it's not just between the East and the West, although there is a very long tradition. For example, a Victorian sense of the aesthetics of the body, for example, which influences many things, including the way we might dress, the way we might sit, and so on, has become part of the way we look at our body. The way and this of course has very deep gender implications on what women should wear, how they should wear, how they should talk, how they should walk, and so on. And we have to ask ourselves, where did these ideas come from? And every society, it's not just about earlier Indian societies or modern European societies, early British society, early European society, all of them had very strong codes which made which colonized the body in particular manner. And that's such an important thing. And I think a lot of important work, for example, in performance art and understanding questions of performance and the use of the body comes back to decolonizing the body. So, but given all this, how can we do this? What does it actually mean to say, I want to decolonize children, given that these are the kinds of ways of approaching the question of decolonization? One, we can, of course, say that the best way, one of the immediate ways which we need to think about is to decolonize children in education. Education, as I said, which everybody knows, every colonial government knows, every state knows it. The present government in Delhi knows this very well, that education is where politics is needed, because it is through education that you control the people in a society. Okay, at least one segment of the country. In fact, for when you keep people out of education and you have an enormous number of laborers in the non-formal sectors without labor rights and so on, it is also because you have produced a particular model of education which does not let these people access, which will never let them get the kind of things which you need to show in order to say that you're educated and therefore you can get the following jobs. So definitely the question of education as a way of control is very much a colonial project. And by colonial, it's not just what Macaulay did or what the British did with India. It's about what every state government does, every state and central government does in our education every day of our lives today. There is also a very important question of the decolonizing question, which has come about in children's rights. I'll give you an example of it to show how, what a vibrant set of questions have come about in that idea of children's rights and universal children's rights. You can also talk about decolonizing children in the very definition of children. Who is a child? Who defines what a child is? Where does that definition come from? And so on. I'll come to that a little bit more in my next slide and tell you a little bit about it. And therefore, because it is connected to questions about notions of authority and autonomy. Because the way we end up defining children are those over whom you have certain authority, and those, the people who are children are those who do not have autonomy for various social acts. And therefore, these definitions raise very important questions of whether children are individuals. Are they independent? Should they be seen as individuals, or should they be seen as social entities? And how do we look at the question of education or the larger context of training children in order to respond to these questions? I'll give you one example of this very vibrant debate on children's rights and the question of how even something as what you might call as something as quote unquote universal as human rights and rights of the child, an extension of the human rights document into the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UNCRC document passed in 1989. Just to give you an example how contentious this itself is. While one might think that the language of universal rights is something which should matter to children across the world, a very recent piece, and there are many such articles around this, and I'm sure you would want to look at many of them. A recent piece by Faulkner and Nyamutata in the International Journal of Children's Rights, I think published last year, points out to certain, very important problems even within this UNCRC document. The claim by not just these authors and other authors whom they also discuss in their paper points out that this particular document enshrines Western notions of childhood upon which its rights were constructed. In other words, to say that children should have rights doesn't make much sense unless you define two things. One, what is a right? And that's a very different debate. But the other very important thing is, what is a child? Who are children? And the definition of children, and I think as also the concept note of your conference points out, has been very deeply influenced by Western theories of childhood. And that's exactly the point which they discuss in great detail, how this is actually enshrined within this document. So I'm just pointing out one or two important critiques of it, just so that we understand even something as so-called universal as children's rights are very problematical. For example, they feel that this document is actually about the power dynamics and colonial legacy upon which views of children are formed. So the way they look at children from Asia and Africa, and the way in which you think the rights have to be granted to children of Asia and Africa are based on certain colonial legacy upon which which influence ideas of children. And they also see this as a moral crusade, and not they and many other critiques of these documents point out that this is like a moral crusade to save and individualize children of the third world. And there's a very the point about individualization is extremely important, because although one might think, for example, about children labor, etc., which have become so popular, and many of the American multinationals, including Nike, Adidas, etc., often will say we will not buy, we will not source from factories which use children. So the question of child labor has become such a big dominant term within the rights language coming from the West in their response to Asian and African labor economy. And the point what they are, the point the critics are pointing out is these are attempts to locate, define something special to a child in terms of what they call as individualized child. So pull out a child as an individual monad, individual entity, an atomic entity within society. There are other critiques of it, which they point out the children's right narrative, quote, tends to pathologize Southern families for not complying with Western views of parenthood. The focus is on the individual child, is in itself an inherent bias of the convention. And as an example, as a counter example, they discuss the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, which actually does, which responds to this particular document and points out that for them, quote, I'm quoting what they have written here, the African Charter, quotes, imposes certain responsibilities on children towards the family, society, the state, and other legally recognized communities and the international community. This argument that children, therefore, remember that how we understand a child is going to influence how you construct a school, how you construct an educational system, how you respond to children. And therefore, looking at children as beings within a social setting with notions of responsibility towards families and the larger society completely actually what they're pointing out is, if you look at children in this particular manner, in the way in which it is individualized in particular ways, it does not capture the nature of other societies, what they broadly call as non-Western societies, but definitely Asia, African, Middle Eastern societies, which are characterized by interdependent cultural models. The question, the role of the family, for example, we know this, so it is so central to many of our discussions, even in the social sciences and so on. We know even as adults, forget about children, the role of the family is so important in deciding what children study, whom they marry, what they function, and some cases when they have children and so on. And what kind of an internationalization of nature of human beings and children and adults can understand this process. So this question of decolonization are all about are actually going back in the context of decolonizing children, going back and asking us, what is your definition of a child? How do we culturally define what a child is? And if you look at so-called, if you want to look at it as legal definitions in a way, you would say, or even larger social definitions, you would say a child is somebody who is less than 18 years. And 18 years, what is that? Is that an arbitrary number? Remember that these kinds of cutoff age has very deep connections to questions of maturity, sexuality, and so on. Okay, and all of that are inbuilt into something called a number like 18 years. Where did that come from? What happens to children in 18 years when they suddenly become adults? Whether it is about driving license or even entering into to have a drink or whatever it is. And all these notions of a child are there is no one concept of a child. If you want to do a conceptual analysis of a child, the child comes with a set of related concepts, what I would call a web of concepts. It's all interconnected web. There is always a notion of protection which is present in the definition of a child. The notion of guidance, having to be guided, not independent, somebody who cannot be completely autonomy. Repeatedly, you have the notion, including in the questions of the legal age and so on, where children to adulthood is lacking something called maturity. So remember that it's not just about driving and drinking, it's also about voting. That something as a child does not have the capacity to be able to decide on who to vote for, even though we know that adults are voting on how much money you pay them, as is endemic within Indian democratic system. The question still, we still continue this idea that children are just not capable of casting an independent vote. And there are also two other very important aspects. One is that the childhood is more passive as part of a social setup, and a more important aspect, because it connects to questions of gender, is that childhood is characterized by emotion, and that emotion becomes an important driving force of why a child acts, as against the adult, who is the matured. And the definition of mature goes back to questions of distancing yourself from your emotion and invoking something called reason. And one of the greatest myths which comes out from one particular kind of a Western intellectual tradition, I mean, even within the West, as Santos points out, there are many modernities, there are many kinds of conflicts between the dominant within them as against the non-dominant. But within one particular dominant intellectual tradition, of which we are all inheritors of, is to produce a very problematical and I think a contentious opposition between emotion and reason. And therefore, the child is located within emotion, the adult is located within reason. And for those of you who have know this kind of a binary, the function of the binary, you know the same kind of a breakup. For example, emotion, maturity, independence, needs production, etc., is the language of colonization. Colonial discourse on the colonized people, including the British writing on India, are filled with the description of natives as if they are children. So the colonized, so they, if you look at the history of British India, which was a must read for all the civil servants of the British who came to rule India, it's exactly the same kind of a thing, that Indians need to be protected. They are not ready to be independent. And the British rule will make sure that you reach a level of maturity, then we can hand over their capacity for self-rule. And they're very emotional people. They don't have these structures of reason. So much so, they went to the extent of saying there is no notion of mathematics and logic and philosophy within Indian traditions, although we know empirically they're completely false. So the point about colonization here, again, it's not about the British and Indians. It's not about what the French and do with the Africans and so on. It's not about the West and the East. It's about how each of us do this when we describe somebody else with these kind of a conceptual background. Remember, if that was true for colonization, it is much more true for patriarchy. Repeatedly, patriarchy functions by making women children. And it invokes exactly the same. You can even see this in debates on voting, for example. Women were not given the right to vote. And if you look at
Sorry, I think we are facing some technical glitches from the speaker side, but he should be back with us again soon.
they are not independent, they lack maturity, they are emotional, a kind of a stereotype which functions so deeply even in our daily social and institutional practices, not just in India and elsewhere. And therefore, the point that as a child needs protection and guidance means that, remember that all the very regressive politics about women today, including the intercaste attacks, the Kap panchayats, and so on, are all repeatedly invoke the point that our sisters have to be protected. And who's going to do this job of protection then? So the fact that today in 2021 you can reproduce these concepts which hides other concepts such as authority, the notion of a parent. The state can function like a parent. You can have like they do repeatedly, by the way, including in political discourses, the prime minister can be like the father of the nation, for example. Sorry, you're able to hear me? Okay, and also the question of caste. Just like the point about caste is that we invoke the idea of caste in order to be able to say that people, within the caste system hierarchies, that people of certain caste they lack maturity, they can't be independent, they have to be, to the extent that when you have the total outcast, the complete, away from being out of the forecast, as you produce the notion of a child in a sense where there is no autonomy and authority given to them. And given all these are social characteristics, we really have to ask then, who is a child and who is the one who is defining what a child is. And this process is important because children in our day-to-day societies are getting colonized every day. And therefore, one might say, what is the big point of decolonization when there is so much of pressure on colonizing the mind, colonizing the habits, colonizing the body of the child all the time? The children get colonized, right, starting with your family, because you produce ideas of authority figures, the produce of ideas of worry and guidance, and that there are people who are in take care of you, guide you, what is to do the right things, etc. And I'm not saying that these are these are problematical things in themselves. I'm just saying the processes of decolonization. And therefore, when I end with how do we address these questions, I will also, maybe talk a little bit more about it. Children get colonized repeatedly by their immersion in any set of cultural practices, whether it's religion, caste, gender, class. We know very well that most gender habits and gender biases are reproduced within families and which children learn at a very young age. And much of these can be seen as how influences of power come from the so-called adult to the child. It is reproduced and we get colonized every day through the influence of media and this extremely problematical social process called consumerism, and through various peers. It remodifies our idea of what is desire, what is ambition, and so on. I mean, it's quite astounding that how much we are actually formed by other people and in a very silent manner. And that is really, I think, one of the most important reasons why decolonization is a term worthy of thinking about. And then in the context of children and schools, of course, education is a major aspect of decolonization. As I said, what you're being taught actually would reflect, very problematical colonized structures, that we feel that these writers are important and these writers are not important. In India, for example, very often it is the case, and I was just talking to a very well-known scholar in India in the social sciences the other day was telling me, he says, you're so exasperated, he's a senior person, and he says, I can't understand that even today, Indian scholars, his own colleagues and others will not refer to work done by other Indian scholars, and that they prefer to refer to some definitely not as important work by them, for some reason. So these seem very difficult things for people to learn to deal with, for the problem of the absence of enormous amount of African and Asian texts and scholars, and also experiences. One might extend the colonization argument to say that our own, systems of knowledge, systems of education in our schools and colleges are actually very, to use a term, in a larger term in the terms of caste, are actually very Brahminized or very dominant upper casted, if you like, where you think that children who should be educated in power structures coming from caste, class, and gender and
Sorry, Sundar,
religion.
sorry to
You
interrupt. I
lost
think,
me? Sorry.
yeah, last point you'll have to repeat.
Yeah, so I'm saying this invisible amount of presence of influence of the power structures in religion, caste, gender, and class, how much it influences what we take for natural and granted. If you ask somebody, why should we do this kind of mathematics or these kinds of English lessons that you do as part of this? I mean, the whole thing about literature itself is since many of your literature students, I'm sharing this with you, I'm sure when you reflect on your discipline, and people have described literature itself as a colonial discipline, as a way to civilize the natives in the great books of England and so on. But if you of course, much has changed, thankfully, today. But what I'm saying is, if we look at what we take for granted within disciplines in our education, we find that there are very deep problems. Right from the definition of education, for some which is utilitarian, for some it's a privilege, for some it's a necessity, but for those for whom it's a necessity are the ones who can never get into our education systems. To the extent that the gross enrollment ratio across India for undergraduate students, like most of all of you, is something like 25 to 27%, which means you're losing out over 70 eligible people like each one of you who will never be able to enter into your college. So these are problems of decolonization. So I'm saying it's not just about the British versus the Indian or the ancient versus modern, etc. There are far greater questions of this unthought living, and that's why I keep going back, and I'll end with that point of why I keep going back to questions of how to deal with these questions. So let me just end with a few very broad comments on how we decolonize children. And these are just programmatic, and if there are questions, we can talk about it. I think the idea of decolonization makes sense to me, or at least I find it somewhat attractive given all the problems people may have with it, is the fact that it allows me to rethink notions of power and authority. And in that sense, I'll say, how do you decolonize adults first? Decolonize parents first before children. But the point here is, how do I rethink questions of power and authority? What do we take for granted? What is invisible and hidden in the notions of power and authority? I think it also raises the question, and something which I'm sure is going to be much talked about in your conference: are there new definitions of children? Do we need a category called children at all? Or if you need something called children, then what is our imagination of children? Who is going to be producing that imagination of children? Is it going to be adults who are going to define what children is? Knowing well that there is a dependency relationship between children and adults to some extent, between parents and child definitely, but still I think there are very interesting questions about how do we redefine children, and especially in today's world, influenced by very specific parts of capitalism and development of certain societies, the emphasis on individual as extreme in hyper individuality, and how it matters, how it perhaps harms our definition of children. So some of the practices which tends to say, well, children are totally independent, they can do this by themselves, etc., may also be not fitting in with the way we want to understand questions of the the children, and therefore the moving from the individual to the social, understanding that relationship is very important. And in terms of classroom practices and in terms of house practices, growing up practices, I think to me the simplest way, rather than colonizing the child's mind all the time, is just to expose them to diversity and multiplicity of experiences across the world. It means that, yes, I'm going to listen to Eminem and rap, but I would want them to listen to, Carnatic music and Hindustani music, or listen to Lata Mangeshkar, or, listen to Rajkumar singing Kannada songs. The point is, somewhere, the notion of exposure to diversity and multiplicity of experiences without a value already added from somebody saying, these are great, don't listen to them, they are these kind of people who are producing this, and so on. And in the context of literature, since many of you are literature and culture studies students, I think, and I can also see there's a lot of material which I see in the concept note about narratives of childhood in Asian context. I would say that stories do only one part of the, they are very important, obviously, because they represent the multiplicity. But I think it's extremely important to find ways to move from the particular to the general. And particularly because colonization and decolonization has always worked under the assumption that what adds value to the hierarchy, to the person who is colonizer, is the fact that what they possess has intellectual value, while those who are colonized do not possess intellectual value. Now, you have to reappropriate and recapture the intellectual value present in the colonized. By colonized, I don't mean Indian culture and so on. I'm talking about the poor, the migrants, the Dalits, the marginalized, people who have not been part of our societies and who do not have a representation in what we teach and what we learn within families which don't come from those communities. And finally, and in a way in which for me, as part of my own exercise and practice in this, after thinking a lot about all these kinds of questions, I realized, and also after teaching philosophy for adults for so long, I decided that perhaps the best way to do this is to start doing philosophy for children. And as Sonia was saying, it's part of many workshops I've been doing. And after doing many of those workshops, I decided I should write a book about it for children. Although it's for children, I think it's become something which others to read it. It's called Philosophy for Children, Thinking, Reading, and Writing. It's not, and the point of my own decolonization project here is, it doesn't talk about any philosophers. The only two names in the whole book are Gandhi and Ambedkar in the context of ethics, but that's about it. For me, the decolonization of philosophy comes from practices of philosophical thinking, which allows the child to reflect herself on her own experiences, on what is it to think, what does it mean to read, what does it mean to write, and so on. In the book, it is just about critical thinking through many of these our own experiences. And finally, I would say, with a note of caution, while we do keep talking about the importance of decolonization, etc., I think it's very important to resist the tendency to colonizations within decolonization. Always tendency to say, this is what I think should be replacing, let's say, the European literature. I want to do this versus something else. So there's a constant awareness that anything we want to impose in the name of some value, saying, oh, these are very important, these are actually very aesthetic, etc., there is a tendency for invoking the values of colonization within them. Once we are aware of this, then we know that there is a much greater possibility of an egalitarian functioning of our society and of learning. And if we do all this, I really don't know if we can create this binary between children and adults. Maybe at the end, after doing all this, we may realize there is much more we as adults might actually learn from children. Thank you.
Thank you, Sundar. We had a couple of glitches, but I think you got on with that. So,
okay, I'm sorry about that.
No, that's fine. I think you had warned me about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll first obviously open the floor to the audience. Now is the time when you can Perhaps unmute or use the chat box to ask your questions. There is already one question that has come up. I'll probably take that one. And then I also have a couple of questions, which, if no one else is asking, I would probably ask at least one question in the meantime. Um, so the question is from a student here. Darshanbir, would you want to unmute and ask your question, or should I read it out for you? If everything is working fine at your end, you can unmute and talk.
Yeah, I can also read it if you want.
Yeah, you can do that, Sundar.
Is there any particular definition which we can actually define a child on the basis of where children are like God to the parents? Children are like God. Okay, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as you say, what makes this question of universal definition of child or universal definition of children and children's rights difficult is because we do have a very different understanding of what a child is. So we might hear, as we often do, that there are in certain societies, children even when they are in school can go and stay out or are completely independent. They start relationships. They are with various kinds of things which we keep reading about or seeing when we visit these places. As against a very different view of understanding of what children are, to the extent that I know many Indian boys and girls who will still say, even when they are 50 years old, they are, their parents always see them as children and never as adults in a sense. And I'm sure you've heard this from many people. The point is that definitely there are different cultural understanding, cultural expectations of what children are. The problem also is that, the relationship between a parent and a child is very special. The relationship between parent and a child is not that as between a citizen of a society and other people in the society. And I think what happens with many Asian and African cultures in their response to children is actually based on this deeply rooted human condition of being a parent to a child, and the impossibility of the child to let go of the parent or to stop worrying about the parent. And you can see this psychologically very deeply influenced, for example, in our present digital world today, where all of us are carrying these phones with us all the time, that never before have you had so much of expression of parents' anxiety as as in the present time, because children are being tracked. There are people who you have apps on their phones which tell them where their children are all the time, and it is always legitimized by saying, oh, the world is very dangerous. The world is as dangerous as it was earlier. We have far many more people today, and there are always incidents which are going to happen. And I'm not saying that means that one should let go, because it is very difficult for the parent to say, okay, I'm going to let go. And that's why I said it all works and depends on the way we conceptualize a child and a parent, right? So while people may say like children are like God to the parents, and that would also be a problem, because language like this may also be a way to keep children tied in to do certain things which the parents want them to do. And this is always a contention, right? Whether the child is going to follow the parents' wishes, including what she should study or what she should do compared to what she might want to do. But whether the child has the potential, and I'm sure we have heard every parent say this, when a child says, oh, I want to be a dancer and I don't want to do computer science, the parent will say, well, you don't know about it yet. You haven't had experience about it. Afterwards, you'll regret it. Don't do it. So typically, that's the kind of thing. So even though we may have had this kind of ways of valuing a child like a god, I would still see this in the context of the definition of a child in the most broadest sense. I would still see it as a problem. Remember, there is also the gender question. Many times they will tell you, many of the people who are these so-called protective, who do this intercaste, attack the couple who have intercaste marriages, etc., so-called protecting the sisters, they'll say, my sister is a god to me. I want to protect her. So I think one has to be a bit careful about how these kinds of descriptions become rhetorical tools to help you enforce your power. Okay, presence of colonial is in the very binary. Can we consider knowledge itself? Of course, knowledge is a colonial enterprise, not even just a colonial enterprise. In the sense, it's a very interesting question. A colonial, again, just to extend what you are saying, it's not just about the European and the Indian or the Chinese, etc. The colonial is one in which there is a disproportionate structure of power and the capacity to control those in the lower hierarchies. And if you see that, then knowledge has always been, a source of hegemony. It's only through knowledge. Look at the way we even talk about ourselves with your own friends. The moment you say, I know something about something which somebody else doesn't, you feel
Yeah. Cannot hear you at the
yeah.
moment.
So I'm saying that knowledge itself has got the inbuilt hegemonical structure within it. It does not mean, therefore, we don't work with knowledge. We just open to different definitions of knowledge. Are there kinds of questions of, for example, kinds of moral knowledge which people may have? Knowledge about the body. So even today, look at the kind of hierarchies and oppositions to ideas of tribal medical practice or even Ayurveda from the so-called modern allopathic doctors. It is so deeply inbuilt, higher, prejudices are present, mainly because it's about questions of, hierarchy of knowledge systems and their incapacity to understand. People, tribal doctors who've been living with nature far more successfully than any of us or any doctors or any of us can live in, in a tropical forest for 2 days. Don't have knowledge system which is competing with what they think is a very so-called scientific modern system. So definitely there are very deep questions about what knowledge itself is. And if you extend it to literature, by the way, when you look at literary theories, why is it that there are very few literary theories you talk about or teach, or read about in your own classes, which come from places in which are not from these big dominant universities in the West? Where are all the literary theories produced by small scholars, Kannada scholars in Dharwad, for example, or in places in Karnataka, Mysore and Dharwad, who have produced one of the most important reflections on poetry and kavyas and the prose, which are never part of what you might study? And where does that question of the hegemony come from? So it's knowledge. I don't mean just as technical knowledge or scientific knowledge. This is knowledge within literature, within philosophy, etc., etc. Okay, the next question is about the notion of statutory rape and policies, sexual protection of children. I don't understand the problematics. But how do we decolonize sex education? How can laws under sexual relationship based on maturity? Okay, very difficult question and a very important question, because part of this worry. Okay, so there are many questions of worry about the idea of children, and part of the reason why we produce a category of children which needs protection from adults or from the state. The state also, remember, steps in. And in certain societies, they can actually come to your house and take away the child from the house if they think the parents are not taking care of the child properly, or giving medicines to the child properly, etc. So this idea that the children are weak and have to be protected from adult predators is obviously a very important one, and it is not something which we can remove by saying let's look at the decolonized picture, etc. So I have to be very careful when I'm saying this. I'm just saying that we need to start opening up the way we think about it and not take children for granted, particularly in the context of not just sex education. Sexual exploitation of children is, as I said, a very sensitive subject too. And there are, I think, questions of the state protection against criminals, for example. That is very important, and you need that. You need, for example, the function of the police, the function of enforcement, the legal structures, etc. Now, the question about what happens in the exploitation of children also happens in the case of the exploitation of women, for example. So repeatedly, as we know, right, including what the UN is very well aware, one of the greatest problem today is women trafficking of women, for prostitution and stuff. So it's a global phenomena. It's one of the most lucrative, act, and therefore that includes, children put within this notion of, trafficking. So both women and children fall under this category of having been weaker, and therefore they are caught in it. All I'm trying to say is the question of weakness there need not be seen only in terms of individual women and children, but the lack of a social structure which enables their strength. Therefore, I would say that one of the ways we need to think about it perhaps is to say that it's not just about saying whether individually as children, in an essential sense, children and women are weak. Rather, to say that that there are social structures vis-a-vis women and children which are very weak, and therefore they lead to such particular kinds of questions which you say. But having said that, I know obviously we really need to think through very carefully about this question. The next question is the concept of children's literature, but in Indian context, genre of family films are highly problematic power structures or compartment. Okay, the genre of family films have highly problematic power structures. Would a compartmentalized genre be good way to decolonize children in India? I think again the questions of how these genres are formed is actually very useful to think about. Children, I know the one of the reasons, and I think since all of you are literature students and your teachers are there, they may have more better insight in this. But I can see children's literature as a genre which is actually being promoted by the publishing industry. The publishing industry has stakes in what it promotes as, literary fiction, women's fiction, crime fiction, ... And they have lists which are special. There are special publishers for doing this, and children's literature becomes a particular kind of thing. So, in fact, when I wrote this philosophy for children, I thought I was writing a children's book. But then I was looking at children's book, and you have children's book, which many of them are about, telling stories which are fantastical, imaginative, etc. And a mark of a children's book is always to have, to have illustrations. So I was like, the book I wrote is, it takes a child as an independent being who can actually think about the questions I'm saying about, for example, about a chair, and whether she can look at the chair and ask questions about, is the child real, or what is it that I'm seeing, etc., without the mediation of having to present it to them as if they cannot think about it. So maybe, I don't know, it's only the success of it is really whether children do it. And as I said, in my workshop with children, I did find they had a great capacity for doing it, and I presume that's why I wrote it in the book. But I can see that there are these genres which are produced. So for example, when our publisher said illustrations are very important, we need to have these books. And I also said, yeah, great. And of course we have had such fantastic illustrations by Priya Kurian for this book. So the illustrations are doing a particular job, but the innate assumption that children are not going to read a book if it doesn't have illustrations, if it doesn't have color illustrations, is also something which I encountered. And one has to think about the way, sorry, I think you lost me there. One has to think about the way in which these genres are created and who is doing it, etc. Okay, then we have, as a person with the thoughts about decolonizing and to bring radical structural change back in my history classes in my high school, how can we bring the glory of pre-colonial, the societal structure, and the knowledge in the society with the focal moment of decolonizing children? Okay, it's a very important question you're asking, and particularly because it comes back to the question of history. And as you are a history teacher, you know this very well. History is a very contentious subject. There are very deep questions about, whether the history we have taught is already seen through a colonial lens or it is not, etc. There have also been very major discussions, as I'm sure you're aware, that history is not a particular concept which is present in Indian societies, because history, Indian culture, Indian societies did not have a concept of history, but rather they had that of stories, epics, mythologies, and so on. And so this has been a major contention among modern historians in the writing of Indian history, and therefore also in the teaching of Indian history. So, for example, the glory of pre-colonial India as a term will be contested by them, because there are actually very few accounts of everyday lives, and there's a big question about the so-called material of history which are needed. But the fact that there are very little, material on everyday life in which there could have had a glory of a pre-colonial India, etc. So, but having said that, we also have to recognize that much of the history is actually about documentation, and we were very poor at documentation. And where we have documented, we have not even translated it. I know, for example, there are many fragments of texts in Indian mathematics, Indian philosophy, which are lost as fragments or texts which are not been translated. And so much of what we keep talking about India is so incomplete and imperfect because we still haven't done the basic job of even knowing what the resources there are, what kind of access to those resources we could have, and so on. So, so this history question is a difficult question. I'm saying forget about even the glory of the question, the point of the value of the glory. I think it's important to be able to present history in a way in which it is consistent with the conceptual world of those times. I was just doing a review of a book, which is a very interesting book, an historical thing. It's a book by Jairam Ramesh, the politician. It's on a book called The Light of Asia. And The Light of Asia is a poem by a really steeped British colonialist, Edwin Arnold, Sir Edwin Arnold, who was very much against Indian independence, etc. But he wrote a poem on the life of Buddha, and it's published in 1879. Now, Jairam Ramesh's book on the life of Asia is just about the influence of that poem, not about the poem itself. And he points out in this voluminous book how the story of Buddha, which we all grew up with, which I took for granted all my life, was actually not available in Indian societies till Arnold's poem. So his argument is Arnold's poem, which is not necessarily not a great poem, and which I'm sure most of us haven't heard of, called The Light of Asia, talking about Buddha's story, which has already been recorded earlier. We get our modern sensibility of the story of Buddha and the Western fascination with Buddhism. He says, Jairam Ramesh says, comes after the publication of this book. Okay. Now, my point is, I was really struck by it because I said, where is Buddha in pre-colonial India? So I asked some of the people in Kannada, Tamil, etc., do they know of any texts which have written about the life of Buddha in Kannada, Tamil, etc., pre-colonial times? Or are they present in performance traditions like in theater? And these are scholars who know this field very well, but although they didn't want to commit themselves fully, they said as far as they knew, there was nothing. So what I'm trying to say is what is this pre-colonial India? What is its structure? Needs a lot of work. And I'm very glad that a lot of very interesting historical work is coming now. And we have to find ways, of course, of talking about, the good and the bad of our history of the pre-colonial India in the right way, and leave it to the children to decide, and it's a very important way of decolonizing children, as you suggest. I think it is an important one. The next question is, what's your opinion on gender neutral parenting? Should we adhere to cultural norms while raising children? I feel there's a need to start raising children differently, but then they stand at risk of being outcast in our heteronormative. Yes, I agree with you entirely that they may stand at risks, but definitely that.
Sundar, lost you there. You're muted, I think. Not muted, it's
Particular kind of stream,
mhm.
okay, particularly professional stream in education. Okay, they push their children, the boys in the family, even though these are very sensitive parents about the gender, they tend to push their boys into these kinds of streams, and the girls are allowed. Girls are also pushed, but they're also allowed to be continue their interest in art and music and dance, for example. So this is, I think this runs so deep, and a society like ours is more than heteronormative. It's just deeply driven by the prejudices of adults much more than that of children, and that really, in the name of the invisible pressure of society, we tend to reproduce many of these problems of colonization. But it doesn't mean that if more and more people start doing this, as we can see already with the amount of girl children in schools and in colleges and in professional education, there is definitely a major change which has happened. um, then the question, in my PU, our English literature textbook was a compilation of poetry and literature translated from the South Indian languages with some works with some Western writers. But as you mentioned, my classmates were opposed to accepting it as literature. Is there an approach where we can make people realize the necessity for plurality and accept literature from our culture when our minds are already colonized? Yeah, again, you're coming back to a very important question. And I think here is where the role of the teachers is extremely important. How do we do that? Because why is it that somebody is reading an obscure British poem will think there is some value to it, while they can't understand a poem written in Malayalam or Bengali which has been translated, or Kannada? What does it makes them think? What does it makes them think that these are not, they are of dubious poetic value while those are? One of the ways is, of course, because when people get the hierarchies of values, aesthetic, ethical, scientific, etc., whenever there's a hierarchy of values, it comes because they have been taught that those kinds of practices and those kinds of literary productions have value because your literary theories are about them. So we might read, in modern context, you might read Gayatri Spivak or Derrida or whatever else, or Eagle, Tan, etc., on literary theories. And I've looked at literary theory books which many of our undergraduate students read, and I'm astounded to see there is nothing in it which reflects the kind of the poetics tradition, the tradition of poetics, and the critical philosophical work on aesthetic theories of literature, which comes not just from Rasa theory, then from the Kashmir Shaivism, Abhinav Gupta's work, and then post that in contemporary times, many people writing, as I said, in Kannada, Hindi, Tamil, Malayalam, Bengali, etc., on understanding essays and poems and so on. Now, as long as they are never part of the knowledge system, and that's why my problem with literature is that it reduces much of literary works as empirical works done by some people. So it's almost like Dalit autobiographies, which, as more courses teach. But the Dalit autobiographies become, testaments to the kind of life and the suffering which individuals have gone. To move that kind of personal narrative to an intellectual position, to read them as books of knowledge, to read them as books of sociology, which is telling something very deep about the inequalities present in society, it needs a different skill, needs a different view of what literature is and the function of literature. And as long as we don't do that, this problem is going to continue. And I see that as a problem within literature as a discipline itself. But I'm sure there are individual teachers who make, who transcend it, and who are able to make you see this in a different manner. Okay, and the last question, as well as I can see here, is about a point you referred in today's talk. The factor of dependency upon some adult body makes the decolonization process of children more complex. How to deal with that? Yeah, the factor of dependency is there always upon the notion, some adult, and the adult, as I said, can range from parents to husband to uncles to the state to the government, etc., etc. So the parent, becomes this kind of an authority figure. And here, I think here is where the question of definition of children become very important. Like in the African charter that I mentioned, there is a suggestion that, look, once we start looking at children not as dependent on parents, but as being responsibly connected to parents in some sense. Okay, and I know that when we talk about freedom to children, etc., which is a very individualization of children, which the critique of this universal charter, the UN charter, is about this kind of an individualization, which is not true perhaps culturally of our children. And I'm sure that many parents would not want their children to be completely divorced from them by the time they're 13, 14 years old and make their own decisions, etc. Parents want to be in a relationship with children in a far different manner than it could be in the West, for example, or at least certain dominant societies in the West. So I think the best way to therefore approach this is to find ways in which you have the space for a child and the space for an adult. And what is the best way to do it? And as I go back to this idea of reflective thinking, a lot of practices of what is it to be a child, what is it to be an adult are received. And that's why the colonization process works all the time, because it is untaught and received, and we take it for granted that that's how the way it is. But once you open up the space to allow children to reflect upon their own dependency. So the point is, dependency does not have to be forced upon them. Dependency can be individually cognized, individually reflected upon. When children reflect upon it and say, yeah, that makes sense. I know I can't do the following. I know I need my parents' support to go to this school, etc. And I look upon this as a kind of a way in which I can, and I know that they are dependent upon me emotionally, I am dependent upon them emotionally. Given these contexts, what can I do and what can't I do? Okay, I'm just giving you one really vague idea of responding to this very difficult question. But I think that question, dependency has to be de-linked from the question of children. So let me take your question and re-look at this question. Can I define what is a child or who is a child without invoking the question of dependency, or without making it depend entirely on the idea of dependency? Okay, and that is an interesting question to think about. Okay, and there's one more question, maybe. Sonia, should I take that? Last one, I think.
Yeah, this would be the last question.
Okay, do you think there's a need for new children's films and stories for children about the pre-colonial Indian society, mythology, history, and stories like Jataka tales, which will bring new thoughts and ways of philosophy for children in the long term? I love folk stories. The so-called the British and the Russian and Korean and stuff. I also love folk stories from the many regions of India. And to me, a child who is any individual, both adult or a child or whatever, who is given this exposure to read, and that's why the question of library becomes very important. Okay, and library in the house or in the colleges and in the schools, where they have a capacity to just encounter these books. No, it may be the case that a child might read all the folk stories of South India, North India, etc., the Northeast, but then might suddenly get fascinated by Russian folk tales, and that's great. That's not the point. Is not about what individually might attract each of us, but the point is about whether the society, family, and the school and the education system has to expose them to these possibilities at an equal footing. Not put them in such a way that most of the essays you read, like I've seen in some literature, government syllabus, most of the essays you read are from, different parts of the world, which is very good, but again, from very famous names from the West. And, they are important, but by since everything has a limited time and we have limited effort and time, it is to the exclusion of many important essays written by people across the world. So there is always a choice being made when we choose a syllabus, when we choose what to teach. Now, the point for me, therefore, is that limitation has to be communicated to the student. Instead of communicating that to the student, if I say that I'm choosing these authors because I think they are more valuable than others, which justifies why I'm choosing them, that creates the hierarchy in the colonization idea. Rather, I say, look, at this stage, I think if you read these authors, you might give you a different perspective, which I think is useful for you at this stage in your career. But by doing this, I'm extremely sorry that I'm not able to draw upon equally important pieces which we should have studied in class, but we are not able to do it. So I think small practices of pedagogy, small practices of egalitarianism and resisting this hegemony can actually help very deeply with the decolonization process. So definitely today there are a lot more books like very beautifully designed ones on Indian folk tales, Jataka tales, etc. For me, the greatest influence as I was growing up was Amar Chitrakatha, which is the way in which we received, the Chandamama and Amar Chitrakatha are still to me one of the greatest sources of stories we got, whether it's true or not, etc. are secondary, but right from kings and queens stories and so many of these things, when our own texts were not doing as much as they are doing now. I mean, there's been some change in this, but as I said, history is always contentious and we need to make sure we do it somewhat carefully. Okay.
All right. I think there are a couple of people who want to ask the question, but we are a little out of
Sure.
time.
Okay, what they want to hear.
Jobin, nice to see you after a really long time. I think we'll have to close today because it's evening and everyone needs to pack up, especially the IT team who has been working at the back end. So thank you, Sundar. Thank you for this very insightful. I think you've set the ground for a lot of conversations that we will come back to during the conference now. Because yes, the idea was to start with decolonizing the narrative that we have been dealing with children. But the question, the moment we start doing that, then we're also bringing the question of how do we decolonize the mind and what are we teaching the children? Who is the child, right? And I think these are the
Yeah.
questions which will be at the center of many thoughts that would probably have, something to add to during the next 3 days as well. Thank you so much for this very enriching. I mean, you took us to many places at once. So thank you again from the entire Department of English and Cultural Studies. We look forward to having you for another session another time with another audience. But for today, thanks a lot. And thanks audience as well for staying back later in the evening. And we also hope that you can look at the website, which is there on the schedules that have been sent to you all. We can put it up on chat box once again. Yeah, all the schedules, all the talks, speakers, everything is there on the website. You can have a look. And also Sundar's book, which is right in my hand, and it's very, very beautiful and insightful. In fact, I was thinking, Sundar, that's the last point I wanted to make, that as much as it's for children, I was thinking that this is definitely a book that can be at least taken to an undergrad level of, at the pedagogical level, because some of the questions that our students are asking when we are doing this course called Reading the Child this semester, through which we decided to have this conference on, is actually somewhat on the same lines, right? How do we start thinking about things which have been sort of conditions and embedded in our psyche ever since we were brought in, the kind of text we have consumed, the kind of things we see, right? And I think the kind of and the way in which you have put these questions in a more simplified manner for the child audience, but also I would say a universal audience. I think parents would really, really gain from this book as well, right? Because they'll be the people reading it and they might be actually questioning a lot of things that they might be doing or not doing, right? So I think it's a great space that you have opened up, and we look forward to probably having some kind of a reading of this at some point in our class as well.
I think the point you made about this book also, suddenly makes me realize that the children as a category here is a meaningless category. It's for anybody who wants to read and who think they can experiences. So children becomes actually just a publishing category and not a distinguishing cognitive category in that sense. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you
So,
so much, Sonia, for this opportunity. Lovely to be back amongst your students and look forward to meeting you again, and also with all the best wishes for the conference.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
The link of
Yeah.
the website has already been put up. So those of you who have joined us for the first time can have a look. And we look forward to having you back again in the next couple of days. For now, thank you so much and
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye.